Welcome to Pivot Points, a new series featuring some of the world's most successful women, candidly sharing their stories and insights about how they made it to the top and how you can too. Hosted by Perry Yeatman, a straight-talking global executive and award-winning author who created the career and life of her dreams and now wants to help other ambitious women do the same.
Welcome. I'm Elise Glink, host of Pivot Points. I want to welcome Perry Yeatman to the program. Perry is the actual host of Pivot Points. I'm just the guest host today. And we're going to spend the next few minutes talking about some of the moments in her career that have led her along the path and gotten her to where she is today, which is absolutely an amazing place. So Perry, welcome to Pivot Points.
Thank you, Elise. It's great to be here.
So getting your career off the ground is all about landing the biggest, boldest, baddest job you can. But there's always a launch moment. What was the job that you think really launched you into your career path? And what was it about that job that made it so important?
You know, it's absolutely right. Really, for me, I think there were 2 points of launch. The first one was my first professional job, my first job that was a full-time job in the career field that I had chosen, which was communication. And I landed this one, I got out of college. I was a lit major, right? So my dad and I frequently talked about how, what was I going to do to support myself? And I had made a deal with myself that by the end of the summer, one way or the other, I was going to land a job in my career field. And so I basically sent out resumes to every PR, marketing communications agency in the country trying to land a job. And about halfway through August, I got a reply that was positive, and it was from a guy who was actually starting a firm. So I was going to be the second hire behind the CEO. Okay. And I thought, I wasn't sure about this because I thought maybe go to a big brand name first or whatever. But I'll tell you, the reason this was such an important decision to go with that teeny firm was because I actually learned not just about how to be a consultant in communication, but actually how to run a business. Because when I showed up being the second employee, I was the chief bottle washer. I made the coffee. I answered the phones. I was the secretary, but I also did the bills and the invoicing. And I got to go to client meetings with a level of client that I never would have gotten to go to had I joined a huge firm. So it turned out to be a really important moment for me because I hadn't studied business. So I really got to see from the inside out how to run a business in my very first job. And I won't tell you that it was glamorous. I did so much stuff that wasn't glamorous, but it was a fabulous learning opportunity. The second kind of launch to my career, since I think what really ultimately differentiated me in my profession was my overseas experience. And that came a few years later when I went to Singapore. And you have to understand, when I left this small firm, I had always had this dream since I was about 13 that I wanted to live in Europe. And so after I got my first few years under my belt, I started looking around, realizing that this small firm, even though we had grown, we were never going to be a global firm in time for me to get a global career. And so I started looking around, and I basically, again, sent out resumes to kind of every one of the major global firms in America. And one of them wrote back to me and said, if you'll give us 2 years in the market of our choice in America, we'll send you overseas. And so I said, okay, I'll make that deal. I did my 2 years. I worked very hard. I got measured on client satisfaction and on business development and all sorts of things. And I kept marketing myself. Every quarter, I wrote back to the head of North America and reminded him, I'm here, I'm doing my job, and I can't wait to go to Europe.
I have to know, Perry, what was the market they put you in?
It was Singapore. It was absolutely classic because I had planned for Europe. We planned for, and they ultimately called and said, Germany. We think it's going to be Bonn, Germany. I said, okay, I'll start studying German. And about a couple months later, because the wall had come down, everybody thought Germany be booming. When they finally called, he said, I know it's not what we promised, but it's really a great opportunity. And the manager there is fabulous. You're going to love her. We really need you to go to Singapore. And I knew about 3 things about Singapore at that time. I came from a small town in Pennsylvania. We all had grown up in that town for, hundreds of years. I was not a worldly person, shall we say, about Asia. And I knew 3 things. I knew that it was going to be hot. As a curly-headed person, I thought I'm going to have a bad hair day every day. And I also thought, as somebody who was about 5'9" at the time, I thought, oh my God, I'm going to be the tallest woman in the country. So it really wasn't sounding all that good. But in the end, I did actually take that job on the third call. I mean, it just set me off because now I was overseas at 25 in a market where I was actually dealing with the head of Asia Pacific for Citibank. And when John Reed came out to Asia, I actually got to work with him as a client. That would never have happened. In New York, I wouldn't have seen John Reed or the head of a region for a decade. And yet I got to do that work hands-on in Asia. So I really think it's those two things that made a difference. And on the surface, neither one of them was something I wanted, but they turned out to be the best opportunities I could have had.
So I want to call, our listeners' attention to something that never happens anymore, but that you and I, being a woman of a certain age, we had to do, as did the guys our age, which is actually create a resume and send it everywhere by mail. What I'm trying to get at is that the perseverance required for that, the follow-up, the diligence, the connectedness. There was no LinkedIn, there was no Google, there was no, there weren't any cell phones. I mean, this is really when we talk about having to, shoe leather, old-fashioned shoe leather, that's really what was required to get you in the door.
That's exactly right. In fact, when I talk to students these days, I actually remind them that, despite my looks, perhaps, that when I started, the fax hadn't even been created, right? Like when we got a fax in my first job, I was so excited. So, I mean, that just it's a whole different world out there. And I think, it's the pros and cons, because I think that on the one hand, we had to put in a lot more shoe leather. But frankly, it was an easier network because there were fewer graduates, and there were, certainly if you had gotten out of college at that point in time, you had a better chance, an easier chance perhaps. The competition was more domestic. You weren't competing against everybody in the world. So I'm not sure it was easier, but it was really, really different how you landed your first opportunity.
When you think back about Singapore, is there one moment in Singapore where you said to yourself, I know I'm going to make it big in this industry? Where was that moment, and how did it come about?
That moment might have even happened before Singapore, and I credit my first boss with this. He was not a great boss in all ways. He was very difficult and could be incredibly harsh. Today, his behavior would not have been accepted. But what I will tell you is that he was still, to this day, one of the smartest men in my industry that I have ever had the privilege to work with. And he told me early on, and I thought, it was rude the way he put it, but he was so right. He's like, if you could just shut up and get out of your own way, you could be great in this field. You've got all of these things. And he listed, what are the things that I had that could really make me great in this profession? And I just thought, the reason that was a turning point for me was nobody had actually ever said that to me before. I mean, I was a lit major. I had picked this kind of because I liked the idea of it. I didn't have any particular qualifications that I was aware of, but he really saw in me somebody who was a broad thinker, who could go big and strategic and then could also get down in the detail. He saw me as somebody who, despite my propensity to talk loud and fast and a lot, that I actually was really good at interpreting what people were saying, whether they actually were verbalizing it or not. He understood my drive to want to help other people, to want to make clients successful, and to just be really driven about embracing what they needed. And these things turned out to be really, really important. So I think it happened before there. And then it happened again at each point in Singapore when I got an amazing opportunity to work with world leaders through Citibank. And then when I went to Russia and I got to work for one of the Minister of Privatization on the largest privatization in history. And then when the U.S. Treasury hired us to launch the $100 bill. And then, every one of these was such a landmark opportunity in my field. And I just felt so lucky to get to be on the team that got to do that work. And I attribute that to, yes, my capabilities, but also really to the fact that I was the one willing to take the risk to take on assignments that everybody else was thinking, oh, that sounds really hard. That sounds very far away. I'm not really sure that I could do that. And I just thought, back to thinking what Bob had told me, my first boss, I just thought, I can do this. If I could figure out how to become a business person from an English major, I can figure out how to do public education around privatization and economic reform.
What I think is really instructive for everybody listening is that you cannot overstate the importance of having a mentor. So Bob, clearly, your toughest, biggest, baddest boss, but he believed in you. and he helped guide you to a place as you were growing in your early 20s. So he's giving you those opportunities as he's mentoring you and growing you into them. And I just think you can't overstate that. And then the second thing I'm hearing that I think is you can't overstate as well is the importance of taking personal risks. And back 25 years ago, going to Singapore was a really big deal. It was far away. It's not a place that you'd probably had to go to your local post office to make a phone call home. That's the kind of life we had. It wasn't like you just pulled your cell phone out and instantly you were Skyping with people. Those two things of having a mentor and being able to take risks are really what I think help launch women particularly successfully. And it's clear that it happened to you. I know it happened to me in my career, and it's super important. Let's move to mid-career, because this is a time, and I think the timelines get a little bit jumbled here because some women marry a little bit earlier, some marry late, some have kids early, some have kids later, some never have kids. But this period of the career where you're juggling, maybe you've got kids, maybe not, maybe you've got aging parents, maybe not. There are always so many compromises that you have to make. Let's dig in and talk about some of the ones that you had to make.
I firmly believe that you can have it all. I know that we've had this discussion so many times with so many women. I do believe you can have it all, but I also believe you cannot have it at the same time. So I think you're absolutely right, Elise, that you need to be prepared to make choices and compromises along the way. And you just need to get comfortable with that. So one of my best tools for doing that was actually what I call the power of three things. I was very intentional about my career and honestly about my life. And I know that some people just go along. And what I will tell you is I think it's really important to have a plan and be intentional. Now, your life is never going to roll out the way you think it's going to. I mean, I don't know anybody who actually executed the plan exactly the way they thought. But having a plan is really, really important for your peace of mind and to better help you get where you want to go. So my power of three is every year I would sit down at New Year's and I would think about what are the three most important things I'm going to focus on this year. And what I meant by that was I recognized that you could maybe do three things exceptionally well at any one time, but you certainly can't do more than that. So, for example, I would say, I would have picked in my 20s, I would have said it's going to be my work, it's going to be my family, meaning my sisters and brothers and parents, and I might have said it's going to be, travel or adventure or something like that. So those are the three things I really wanted. And I would then give myself permission to say, okay, so that means that I'm not going to worry so much about whether or not I work out 7 days a week. And I'm not going to worry so much about whether or not I write the great American novel. And I'm not going to worry so much about whether or not I have kids that year. Because I had decided what I did focus on. It didn't mean I didn't do those other things, but it did very clearly mean that I was focused on three things and I was not going to carry the guilt of all the other things that I would do. I still worked out, I still competed, but I was not solely dedicated to that. I wasn't worried if I was beating my 5K time, every week. So that's one thing, is the power of three and making choices and being clear and intentional and then letting go of the guilt about the things you haven't chosen for that year. And another trick I'll tell you is as I got older and I got married and then I had children and then I decided to write a book. There were years where I remember very clearly talking to my husband where I said, okay, the three things this year are going to be Craft, because I was working at Craft, Kirsten, who was my daughter, and then a book that I was writing. And so I said, if those are my three things, you do notice, honey, that I don't make my list this year and you don't make my list this year. So I said, it doesn't mean that I'm going to let myself completely go and get unfit and get, sick and vice versa. It's not like I'm never going to have, I'm never going to be a supportive spouse. But I was very clear that those were the three things in that 1 year I was going to dedicate to make sure that I did those three things exceptionally well. So the last thing I would say about this mid-career period is I agree with you. You can, whether you go early or late or whatever, the way I made it work for me was basically two things. One, I don't think that the choosing of the right partner the importance of that can possibly be overstated. You don't know where your life is going to go exactly, but you need to really think about picking somebody who might be interested in the journey that you are interested on and who also is okay with the fact that your career may dominate at times. So you got to pick somebody who's got enough confidence and really can handle you and wants to be your partner on that journey, wherever that journey goes, and vice versa. You want to be their partner. The second thing that really helped me, and I was lucky enough to find that guy. Because, I'm sure that I scared plenty of guys along the way, but, I finally met one who was, my match intellectually and who was really comfortable with me taking the lead. And he actually chose, when we moved to Chicago for me to join Kraft, he chose to give up his career. And he really took care of our daughter, who was then 18 months old. And so he became a stay-at-home dad. And that, it had repercussions and it made it tough on the marriage at times, for sure. But we both agree, looking back, it was the right choice, and our daughter has turned out, fabulously because of that. I think I also benefited that I actually did a huge amount of stuff career-wise before I had kids. My husband had been married before, so I have a stepson who I love and who I was lucky to get, if you will, into my life at age 9. But I waited to have my own children until I was almost too late, at 38. So the truth is, I had already had what some people would consider like 3 careers between, Singapore and Russia and London and the U.S. and Unilever. And it was like I'd already had so many careers by the time I got pregnant that it let me do 2 things. 1, I was well established by the time I had kids. And 2, I was then not conflicted. I really wanted to be a mom. And it made the juggling so much easier because it was clear to me that I was not going to give up my daughter in order to get ahead at that moment, because at that moment I was already pretty far ahead and felt good about where I'd gotten to.
I love your point about having a supportive partner as a spouse. All the traveling I'm doing as I'm launching my new business, he's perfectly happy to have his law practice in 2 blocks from our house, and it's very successful. He's happy making sure the house works and things are fixed there. And that's just what he wanted. He wanted real home while he has a very successful career as well. But he has made his career move around so that the household works. And I think that's really crucial. Let's talk a little bit about transitions. It is a transaction, though, because when you start negotiating for pay and for job title and for where you're going to go next, how many job changes have you had? And what are some tips that you can offer our listeners for being able to negotiate through what I'm sure were some very tough moments?
Certainly through a lot of my career, I probably changed roles about every 18 months. And I probably changed companies maybe on average every 5 years. I think the way I think of it, and you are right to think of it as negotiation. And the most important thing to think about is it's always a two-way street. When you go in to think about or to ask for what you want, and I think one of the things that women we really need to do is we need to be super clear, both inside and then in talking with others. We need to be super clear what we really most want, right? You never get everything, and certainly not at the same time. So at each one of these points, every one of these pivot points, you need to be thinking, what is this really about for me? What do I really want? And don't be scared to say if what you really want is more time at home or you want something else that's a personal need. But then think, okay, if that's what I want, what am I willing to give in exchange that is super valuable to this company or this organization that's employing me or that I want to employ me? If you've done your homework and it's fact-based and you understand the quid pro quo you're willing to put forward, then any intelligent boss or, potential employer is going to see that and say, oh, okay, so I understand you want this, but I get that. That's a good deal for both of us. I'm willing to make that work. We don't spend enough time thinking honestly with ourselves, even inside, what is it I really, really want? So we can't go out and advocate for it effectively because we haven't really landed and gotten comfortable, back to my rule of 3, with the things that we are not negotiating for. Right? So that's one thing, is what do you really want? I think the second mistake that we make is then not having the confidence to believe that we can really get it. Because I think that if you do your homework and it's fact-based, and this is not just emotionally driven and one way, meaning I want this, please give it to me, then I think you are very likely to get it. And then the third thing is you just have to ask, raise your hand, get out there, and be willing to walk away. If it doesn't happen, and that's what you really need. My experience is that when one door closes, another one opens. And I know that sounds cliched, but I could name so many points in my career where I thought what had just happened was, career ending or difficult, or, oh my gosh, I'd made such a mistake because I had walked away from something or I wasn't willing to accept something. But every one of those times, it actually ended up being one of the best things that could have happened to me.
Give me an example. I want to hear what you felt was, and be detailed, because everybody wants the details, without breaking confidentiality. But give us a taste of what that looked like when the transition or the negotiation where you really felt like you got everything you wanted at that particular moment. Tell us what happened.
I'll tell the story about how I got to London. So the truth is, at about 13, I had gone on a school trip through Europe. And that was the moment that really opened my eyes to the fact that I wanted to live in London. I don't know why. I love the architecture. I love the history. I love the royal family. Charles wasn't married at the time, whatever, right? I'm 13. For all sorts of bizarre reasons, I fixated on, I really wanted to live in London. Well, from Singapore, I then went to Russia. Having survived Russia for 3 years, I kind of said, okay, done. I want a break. I'm going to go to graduate school. I want to change, I actually wanted to completely change careers. I was thinking about politics at the time. So I stepped out for a bit and I went back to the States and I actually took some time off and had a great time. And lo and behold, in my stepping out, the head of Europe asked me, is there anything I could do to change your mind, et cetera, et cetera. And I said, nope, this is true. I'm not playing a game. This is not a maneuver to get more money or to whatever. I said, I really just want a break. I said, but, since you asked, London is the one thing I've always wanted. I want to work in London, but I know you probably don't have any business for me there since you haven't offered that. So I get that. No problem. And I'm seriously thinking about going to graduate school when the phone rings, and it is the head of Europe. And he says, I'm offering you London. And I thought, oh my God, this is just amazing, right? I had gotten time off. I'd gotten rejuvenated. I'd gotten to really reconnect with my family after 6 years living very far away with, as you say, long before we had Skype. And they offered me a great salary and they offered me the location of my dreams. And what they actually said is, look, we don't even have a job for you per se, but you've just always been able to build a business. So we're just going to bet on you and bet on the fact that when we get you here, you will make a book of business for yourself. And, we're all going to be thrilled that you're here. I got to try something else. I deferred grad school. I'd gotten in, I deferred. So I said, hey, I'll go for a year. And if it's not perfect, then I lose nothing. I can quit and I can go to grad school, which is what I was planning to do anyway. Turned out I loved it so much, I stayed for several more years.
You've now graduated into what I would, you've had roles in publicly traded companies. You've had roles at these, big, huge public relations and media relations and communications companies. And now you're sort of running your own ship. And I would say you're absolutely an executive, right? So, let's talk a little bit about that move into kind of the executive suite, whether it's was for Kraft or at one of these large communications firms or for yourself. How is it different for you? And how has it been as a woman, even one who's very forthright and direct and, clearly brilliant, but how has it been for you to sort of move into that world as an executive? And what did it take inside you, besides believing in yourself, to really feel like you belonged there?
I think one of the best drivers that turned out to be in my life actually was for a long time insecurity, because I wasn't sure that I was going to be good enough. And so I always worked really hard to be very prepared and to be, at the top of my game. And so I focused. I think I worked longer and harder than a lot of other people. And it paid off. By the time I got to Kraft, and I would definitely say that by that point, Unilever, I was also definitely at the VP corporate level in a $60 billion company. You are certainly an executive. But at Kraft, I got to the SVP level, kind of like the top 50 globally in a, massive company. So clearly I was an executive at that point. And what I would say is what really changed for me was I got to the point where I no longer was driven by any of the things that had driven me early in my career. So early in my career, I think like a lot of people, I wanted to prove myself and I wanted to make a certain amount of money and I I wanted to see the world, and I wanted to have accolades and win awards and all those kinds of things. And I did all that. But it was doing that then by the time I got to craft, what I realized is that is no longer what my motivation is about. My motivation really became about how do I just make this company the best I can be? How do I make the greatest impact I can? And really make a difference. And of course, yes, hopefully by doing a great job, I will be financially rewarded and, get promotions and everything else. But it really came from a different place. And when it started, my motivation really came from a different place. Then the insecurity also was greatly reduced or put away because I was no longer ambitious for what I would say are some of the youthful reasons that we are ambitious. And I think I got more meaning. This is about the same time, I had kids and got married. And so all of that gave me a lot more perspective. And there's something funny. A lot of people think that women having kids actually can be a hindrance in your career. I actually think it can be a huge asset. Now, I will tell you, I wrote a piece for, I think it was Fortune, where I said that, how being a mom made me better qualified to be a CEO. And I think that's absolutely true. But I will also tell you that the thing that it also gave me was a much broader focus. So that it was no longer that my career was the only thing that I was hanging on to. And when you can let go like that, when it's no longer about you, when it's actually about the bigger picture and the team and the company and about supporting your CEO, it makes you a better professional and you really can be fearless. And I think that's what happened to me as an executive. And what was really, really important is I began to realize it's about the institution. It's about the company as a whole. You need to be able to take a very broad view. The second thing I would say, and it was the hardest lesson for me, when you get to the top, it may not be shocking to a lot of people that to get to the top, you have to be pretty much in control of your space. So I am a bit of a type A personality, and I was used to being in control. And two things happen at the executive level. One is your bandwidth is so broad that you realize you can't possibly control everything, and you can't possibly do everything. So everything shifts from what can I do to what can I help others do? How can I make them more effective and efficient and give them the right decisions or support them along their path? So again, it takes you out of yourself. You're no longer focused on me. You're now focused on the team. And I think those two things are a really important transition. And executives that don't make it are often the ones that cannot actually make that transition to thinking across an entire organization or institution globally, and not about them, but about the team and the people they are there to serve. A lot of people throw around this term servant leadership. I think it really is true of the best leaders that we have. And yes, you have to have ego and you have to be fearless and all those things, because that's the way you keep going when you have moments of doubt. But the motivation is really about the people.
Did you ever have to choose between being liked and being respected? And which way did you go?
I would be interested to know if any woman hasn't had to make that choice at some point. Well, first, in the ideal world, you can be both. I have become super close with a lot of the people that I work with, colleagues, people that worked for me, people I worked for. I have kind of collected them throughout my life, and we remain close to this day, even people I worked with 20 years ago. But what I would say is when push comes to shove in a work environment, for me, I will always choose respect. And the reason that I will do that is because I think when the going gets tough and there's real doubt and people are scared and jobs are on the line, then what the team is looking for, what people are looking for, they need to trust that you can and you will do the right thing. And that is not necessarily about likability. That is about whether you actually have all of those other things you need in order to make the right decisions and to influence people to get the job done. So I think that for me, I do err on the side of respect. But of course, I like to be liked. But I always say to my team, we don't have to become friends, but we do have to respect and trust each other. And I hope that by doing our jobs well together, we will also then grow to the point of liking each other. And that normally does happen, as a matter of fact.
I had a conversation with one of our interns the other day, and I said, you're doing an amazing job, love all the things you're doing. But in our office manual, we have a dress code. Literally, she was wearing something that I think a bikini would have covered more of her. she was freezing because I keep the office extra cold. She said, "Oh, I thought this might be a little bit too bare." And I said, she goes, "But everybody here is so chill. Like nobody said anything." And I said, "It's up to you to be businesslike in an office. You just can't come in here dressed in for the beach. It just doesn't work for everybody. It changes how people look at you." Now, I know it's unfair that women are more harshly scrutinized when it comes to dress than their male peers.
I completely agree with you. I mean, it is unfair. It's a double standard. The amount of scrutiny on women on everything from, what they look like to how they parent their children. I mean, it's ridiculous. These are not the topics that get discussed about, men, whether they are in business or politics or whatever. So I think that it is unfair, but it's also a fact. And while I hope it changes by the time my daughter gets there, I'm not so sure it will. And it certainly hasn't changed today. So we all have to deal with it. It's odd. If you look at the research, I think what you said about appearance is so true. There's 2 sevens. It's the rule of sevens that I read about not too long ago that I found really interesting. The first one was that it takes somebody 7 seconds to form an opinion of you. And I thought, wow, that doesn't give you a lot of time. And the second thing is that they actually, when they form that opinion, only 7% of that is actually based on what you say, which means that the 93% of that is based on other things, whether it be looks or gestures or tone of voice or whatever else, right? So when you think about that, then you really can't just blow this off. You have to think about it. And, I guess I'm lucky. I'm kind of in the sweet spot of looks for women in careers. And what do I mean by that? Well, the research says you do better if you're tall. You do better if you're not so pretty that you seem incompetent, and yet you're not so unattractive that it's a distraction. But the way I handle all of it is I am focused on substance, not looks. So I have a basic, my entire wardrobe matches black because I travel in a carry-on bag every week. So no matter what item I own, it has to match black because I don't want to have to bring more shoes or bags or scarves or whatever. You also can wear black from day into evening. So it's very flexible that way. What I do is I look around and I think, what are the women that I want to be? So if I'm one level below a global CEO, what are the global CEOs wearing? And so in my world, for example, a lot of them wore St. John, right? It's a knit brand. The stuff wears like iron. I've had some of it for 10 or 15 years. It packs like anything. It doesn't wrinkle. You can wear it night into day, whatever. That's what they were wearing. So then I bought those clothes. I bought them in the styles and in the shapes that worked for me. But I kind of went that way because then when they looked at me as an equal and I fit in. I have not usually had a wardrobe where I was trying to stand out because I wasn't trying to make my looks the thing that they counted on. What I wanted to do was blend in with the people at the top. And I'm viewed on my competence and my capability and my contribution as opposed to my look. Mark Zuckerberg does it beautifully for the men. And I would actually love to see more women get into that space. And his reason for doing it, as he says, is, look, it's just one less decision I have to make every day. But for us as women, I would love it because what it does is it just takes that whole element of looks and dress and whatever out of the discussion. It's just you. And then they begin to focus on the substance. And that's what I would say is that you want your looks to work for you, but you want them to work for you in the sense that it lets you get to the value you actually bring, which is not just how good you look at the table.
I really have to ask you, what do you wish you had told yourself back when you were starting based on what you know now?
It's a great question, and I would say 2 things. I would say, first of all, relax. It's going to work out, and enjoy the ride, right? I mean, I was so busy being driven that some years I feel like I didn't even have a chance to enjoy the journey. Despite the fact that, let's be clear, I had amazing vacations and shopping trips and, business trips and whatever. So, trust me, I did not miss those things. But I still think I was just so uptight and so driven that I didn't enjoy actually the moment very, very well. So I think that's one of the key things I would say to myself. And the second thing I would say to myself is always be true to who you are. You can style flex, you can adjust, but you've got to be you. Trying to be somebody you're not doesn't work. Recognize you are who you are and embrace who you are. I think I spent way too much time beating myself up about who I was.
Well, I think that everybody's going to get so much out of this conversation that you're starting today. And I was delighted to be able to be the person who was doing the interview. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Elise. It was great to talk to you.
You've been listening to Pivot Points, a series designed to help ambitious women have the careers and lives of their dreams. To hear more interviews, go to www.yourcareeryourterms.com. And be sure to tell us what you think. If there are topics you'd like covered or people you'd like interviewed,